Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about consequentialism and its relationship to the idea that life is not about black and white, but all shades of gray. So I'm going to start off by describing what consequentialism is and why it doesn't work, where it really falls down, and then finish up with talking about the shades of gray, because it'll make a lot of sense that way. It'll be very natural. So consequentialism is a moral theory, basically, that holds that an action is good or evil on the basis of whether its consequences are naturally good or naturally evil. Natural goods are things like health and wealth and beauty, strength and intelligence and so on. Those are natural goods. Natural evils are things like sickness and disease and poverty and ignorance and so on. Those are natural evils. They don't have a moral quality to them. To be strong is not morally superior to be weak. I am much stronger than my child. That doesn't make me morally better than my child. It just makes me stronger than my child. So that's the distinction between moral goods and moral evils, and how you go from, in consequentialism, natural goods and natural evils, moral goods and moral evils, and how you go from natural goods and natural evils to moral goods and moral evils. The reason why you have consequentialism is that this is contrast with what I sometimes call principalism, though that's not a normal name for it. But what came before, essentially, historically speaking, which you find within Christianity, is that an action has a nature to it. And so it is good or evil on the basis of the nature of the action, not on the consequences to the action. There's some asterisks about foreseeable side effects and so on. I'm simplifying for the moment. But it follows from us having a human nature, that we were given a human nature. This human nature has certain properties, like we're given the ability to communicate in order to communicate truth. We're given strength in order to create things with it, lift up the weak and other things like that. If you look through human nature, we were given things for a purpose. And so if we use the things we're given according to the purpose for which we were given them, they're telos, that's the Greek word for the end, the natural end of something, then that is good. We are following our nature, and so we are becoming ourselves. We're being built up over time to be ourselves. If you're working towards some other end, you are not being built up to be what your nature is, and you don't have anything else to give yourself. So if you're telling lies and you're fornicating and things like this, you are not being built up according to human nature, and you can't give yourself some other nature. And so you are diminishing yourself. These things are evil. And so that's the sort of dominant moral paradigm that you have, the moral theory that you have up until around the Enlightenment, with the death of God. The death of God being a poetic way of saying the people stopped believing in God. And of course, it's some people. So in that creates a void, because we need to be able to evaluate actions somehow. You have to be able to see different possibilities and then choose between them. And so you need some sort of moral theory according to which to choose, so that you're not just purely an animal, just going wherever your nose leads, an irrational beast. And so consequentialism was essentially an idea that came around to try to fill this void. It doesn't really work. As I mentioned, consequentialism is holding that an action is morally good or morally evil on the basis of whether its consequences are naturally good or naturally evil. Now, the basic problem with consequentialism is that human beings don't know what the consequences of their actions are. You sometimes know the very immediate consequences of your actions. If I drop my knife, it will fall. I knew that much. What happens after that? I didn't even predict it making the sound of hitting my ring. That action was seen by all sorts of people. What effect is it going to have on them? I haven't got a clue. Them having seen that may have an effect down through time. Again, I haven't got a clue what those are going to be. It could have some sort of profound effect 15 generations from now that I have absolutely no way of foreseeing. And time will keep on going, and things will still have their effects. And maybe those effects will diminish. Maybe those effects will be enormous. The enormity of effects is really, really easy to see when it comes to something like killing a person, because this has a tremendous effect, if at the very least, if they are still of reproductive age, because then they could have children that won't exist, and then the effects of that are going to be very, very big down through time. Or on the flip side of saving a person, especially if they're of a reproductive age, then the effects of that will also be truly enormous. And we can tell that they will be enormous, but we can't tell what particularly they are, because we don't know who will or will not be born to someone. So while you can tell that the effects of things may well be large, you have no idea what those effects are. Since you don't know what these effects are, you cannot evaluate the action in terms of them. It is simply impossible to do. So while consequentialism promises to give you a moral theory that you can operate with if you don't believe in the existence of a normative human nature, it doesn't actually work, because you don't know the consequences enough to evaluate the theory. So, this, by the way, is true even of looking at the past, too. You can look at the past, and you can't really say what the actions, what consequences these actions have. So you can't say whether or not anything in the past was good or bad, because you don't know what all of its repercussions, in fact, are. You can't tell what something in the future will be, because you won't know what its effects are, and, the present is in the same boat. So consequentialism is, as a moral theory, completely useless. You cannot, in fact, use it. The reason why it sounds at all good, by the way, is because there is exactly one person who actually can, more technically one being, who actually can, and that's God. God can be a consequentialist because God is creating our nature and creates our nature in such a way that it produces good consequences. God sees all of time, God sees everything, and knows what all of the consequences of every action are, and creates our nature in such a way that these consequences will be good. And so God can be a consequentialist because God has sufficient knowledge, that is to say, knows everything. If you are not omniscient, you can't be a consequentialist. And so it's sort of attractive to us because in God, consequentialism and what I call principalism are the same thing. There isn't a distinction between the two of them because God is both omniscient and our creator, and so is creating our nature according to his his knowledge in a unified sort of sense, not in a they're not parts. And so because this is a unified sort of thing, these aren't really distinct in God, and that's sort of where it becomes attractive to people. There's an instinct there that consequentialism isn't wholly wrong, and that's because within providence, that is, within God's governance of the universe, when you do moral actions, good results follow from this. But that's because God worked it out that way. It's not a universal sort of thing. It's actually rather specific there. But that's sort of where it gets its power from. Now that we've sort of looked at consequentialism and the problems with it, where do we get this whole life is shades of gray stuff? Because I have to admit, when I was young, I was really tempted to think that when people would tell you that, simpletons think in black and white, when you know what's going on, you know that everything's just shades of gray, that this is just people who wanted to be bad and were trying to distract people from it, sort of the hand-waving thing, the hand-waving coming from the magician going like, look at the hand, don't look at the other hand, which isn't moving so fast so you can't tell what I'm actually doing. In the same way, hand-waving in order to distract from some other action. It seemed like a pretty good explanation to me, frankly, because it never seemed to come from people who were doing their best to live moral, upright lives. The people telling you it's all shades of gray are the sort of people who'll have to explain why they're cheating on their wife or they're cheating on their husband. It's a complex action. You can't just jump to conclusions about this and see it simplistically. Yeah. That's because you don't want to face what you're doing. All right, that was my instinct, but I realized recently that, in fact, consequentialism mandates this shades of gray stuff. Because, remember, consequentialism means that an action is morally good or morally evil on the basis of its consequences. Whether its consequences are naturally good or naturally evil. Well, the thing is, every action, its consequences are naturally good and naturally evil. At least if you're being a little bit broad about it, because if you're including potentiality, that is, because every action, in virtue of being a definite action, has some results that will happen and forecloses other possibilities that could have happened. So if if you eat a bagel, then somebody else can't eat that bagel. And so if you're considering it in that full sense, including potentiality, you are in the very act of doing anything definite foreclosing potential, and that is a form of natural evil, or at least it can, be considered as such. And typically is. And so thus, every action has both naturally good and naturally evil consequences. I mean, heck, even if you murder a person, you're at least feeding the worms. Somebody is benefiting from everything that happens. Whenever potential forecloses, somebody else benefits from the result. Somebody else has potential that they would not have otherwise have had. This is just going to be universal amongst actions. And so, if you hold to consequentialism, every action is both morally good because of the naturally good consequences that will follow, and morally evil because of the naturally evil consequences that will follow it. You will always get both. If you save a man's life and he has a child, and that child turns out later to be a murderer, well, there was good and there was evil in what happened. And so, this action of saving his life in consequentialist land is both morally good and morally evil. Applies to everything. So consequentialism basically necessarily muddies the waters. Because, what's muddying the water? It's taking water and dirt and then mixing the two of them together so you don't have pure water and you don't have pure dirt. You have this sort of admixture of the two that you can't really do anything with. You can't drink it. You can't wash with it. You can't, sufficiently muddy. Fish can't live in it. It's not really good for anything. It's not firm like dirt. You can't build anything on it. It just doesn't have any real use at all. And so, consequentialism is like that. It muddies the waters. It mixes good and evil because it intrinsically does. And so not only is it utterly useless as a moral theory, it's also very blinding as to the nature of reality, because instead of being able to see good as good and evil as evil, you have to see them both as muddy admixtures of the two. And you can, depending on what you feel like, say like, oh, well, there's more good than evil here, but well, that's going to depend almost entirely on what you look at. Because, of course, both the naturally good and naturally evil consequences, if you work it down throughout time, you can concentrate on one or the other and see a lot more of whichever one you want. Sort of a side note on consequentialism. Consequentialism is just a thin veneer of, it's like, if you've ever seen cheap cabinets or other cheap furniture where they print on contact paper something that looks like a picture of wood grain, and then apply that on top of particle board. That's basically what consequentialism is. You paint a picture of rationality, and then glue that on top of just being an irrational animal and doing whatever you want. And so you're sort of pretending to be rational, while in fact you're just doing whatever you feel like. That's consequentialism, and it's not just an excuse. It's not just something that allows you to pretend to be rational while you're not. If you actually try to follow it, it actively inhibits you from being rational, because it muddies the waters so you can't even see things for what they are. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at,